Okay, welcome to our fourth and final lecture on writing the research paper. Today we're talking about synthesizing your research, utilizing sources, and some of the ticky-tacky MLA stuff about using sources, all right? So let's jump in. First, let's talk about synthesizing your secondary research. Remember, secondary research, those are your sources. Those are the other people that you've gone out and read and found from articles online, from books, from things from the library, secondary research, all right? So there are two ways that you can engage with secondary research, all right? Once you've collected all of your sources and you're thinking about how to incorporate them into your paper. The first method is what I like to call central engagement. And what I mean by that is this is where a major part of your thesis or argument involves engaging or responding or specifically addressing closely one or two of your secondary sources, all right? So this is where you read something, one of your secondary sources, and you're like, oh, I completely disagree with this person right here. And my thesis is all about going to be proving them wrong. So your paper may involve a lot of engagement with just that one particular source. It may have to come up in your thesis statement, and you may need to do a lot more summarizing and quoting of that particular secondary source or two. But like your argument is really involved with directly. Maybe central engagement could be called direct engagement, like directly talking back to one or two of your key sources. And obviously you'll have to use the rest of your sources as well, but there'll be a little bit more of the tangential engagement, which brings us to the second way to engage with secondary research, which I call tangential engagement. And this is where your argument or your point is sort of developed more independently, and you support your argument and your point with a wider network of your sources, right? So you're not so centrally focused in on responding to one or two key research sources. You sort of have an independently developed argument, and then you're showing the different ways that all of these people are sort of supporting them. So you may quote more sparingly or just in a briefer way, and just use a wider group of sources to support multiples of your points. Is one way better than the other? Not necessarily, right? And it may be back and forth. You may have one paragraph that's sort of central engagement and other paragraphs that are more tangential where you're drawing from a bunch of different sources, or your paper may be that way entirely. You do have to use all of your sources no matter what. You have to use at least 8 secondary sources. Don't forget that. But this is two ways of thinking about how to engage with them, about how to use them. Are you really going to directly respond and centrally engage, or are you going to make your points more independently and use a wider array of sources to support you? So let's talk about the nitty-gritty of actually getting your sources into your paper, all right? So one of the best things to do is to actually directly quote your sources word for word when they say something that's really important for you to sort of explore and explain and develop, all right? So you attach quotes. Make sure that you always attach your direct word for word quotes with correct punctuation, all right? It depends on the grammar of the sentence. It's going to depend on your situation, but you want to be careful about this, all right? So anytime you announce that you're quoting something, researchers say, this person said, this person wrote, you're going to want to have your comma. Sometimes a colon will be appropriate, and then you have to use your quote marks. So you have to use your quote marks around anything that is directly word for word taken from your source, all right? So you'll see there, researchers say, comma, quote, the evidence shows, and you'll even see that the is capitalized, right? Because if it's capitalized in the source, you should use it. You should capitalize it there, okay? and then end quote mark. And then you'll see, sorry, it's on the second line, so it looks a little different. But on the second line there, you'll see the parenthetical citation for this, right? And this is what I want you to pay attention to. I have my ellipses here, but I don't have final end punctuation in that quote mark. I have my parenthetical, my author, researchers, I made that up, 7, also a made up page number, end parenthetical, and then the period that ends the sentence. That is the standard way to incorporate a direct quote with correct citations and with good MLA, okay? Second point to remember is that you integrate your quotes into the grammar of the sentence, meaning everything needs to make grammatical sense, okay? So if your sentence is talking about things in present tense, but the quote that you draw from your source is sort of talking past tense, you need to make tenses agree. You may need to actually change some things in the quote itself to make the sentence have correct grammar. So there's sort of two ways to do that. The first way to do that is to use brackets. You'll see those are the brackets, those square parentheses, square brackets, to change words that are in your direct quote to make it make grammatical sense. Any reason you may need to change a word in your sentence, you use those brackets, and that indicates I've changed this word just a little bit. All right. And then the second thing you can do is use ellipses. That's the dot, 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 period, 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 to skip parts in the middle of a direct quote if you need to, right? But if you need to make things make sense, or if you don't need that information there, use brackets or use ellipses, okay? And then what I talked about, that parenthetical citation above, parenthetical citations come after the quote marks, but before the end punctuation. This is a rule for MLA. It may work differently in other citation styles, but know this for MLA, which is what you're using, okay? Author says, comma, quote marks, direct quote here, no end punctuation, quote mark, parenthetical page number, then the period, okay? That's how punctuation works for direct quotes. Now it's going to work a little bit differently in some other situations. So let's talk about block quotes, because block quotes is where it works a little differently. So you use block quotes anytime that you're quoting from your source for more than 4 lines of typed out text, all right? So if you're using a big chunk from your from your source, you're quoting a big chunk word for word, what you have to do is you introduce your quote somehow, and then either a period or a colon or some other form of punctuation, you just jump down to the next line and you indent. And the entire quote is going to be indented, but you don't use quote marks on block quotes. No quote marks. Just the indent indicates that it is a quote. So indent all the lines of the quote, have your end punctuation like normal, then your parenthetical. It is opposite of the in-sentence quotes, right? So block quotes are a little bit different. Remember that the rules are different for block quotes. My final piece of advice on block quotes, use them sparingly, all right? Like I'm talking maybe not more than 1 or 2 per paper. You want to paraphrase as much as possible if you're using lots of information from your sources, just because it makes for better flow in reading. You don't want to have a whole lot of block quotes. And I've seen students before who have had block quotes on every page, and I can tell you right now that I see right through that. That's a tactic for filling up page space, which is another reason to avoid using block quotes. So if I see your paper just chock full of block quotes, it's not going to sit well with me. Use them sparingly, all right? Only when you really feel like you need that big chunk of text to really talk about something. Okay, so let's talk about indirect quotes. This is when you're not quoting necessarily word for word, right? So this includes summarizing, okay? Either summarizing the entire argument of one of your sources, or you're just summarizing large sections of your secondary sources, but you're not really using any direct word for word quoting, okay? And then second and very closely related is paraphrasing, all right? Summarizing and paraphrasing sometimes go back and forth. But paraphrasing is when you restate something your secondary source said, but in your own words, once again, without quoting them word for word. Here's the key thing to remember about indirect quotes. Whether it's summary or paraphrase, you still need a parenthetical citation, all right? Absolutely, 100% still have to cite where you're getting all of your information from, okay? So where that parenthetical citation ends up is going to depend on how much summary and paraphrasing you're doing, but you want to get that parenthetical citation as close to the information that you're indirectly quoting as possible, okay? So maybe that's at the end of the sentence where you did the paraphrase, and again, end of the sentence, the period's going to go after the parenthetical, even if there are no quote marks, all right? We'll look at some examples in a second. Or if you have several sentences of summary or paraphrase, it might go at the end of that, but as close to the information as possible, all right? And then I mentioned this in lecture 3, talking about how to do good body paragraphs, and we're going to talk about it again here because this is so important. Always, 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 after quoting from a source, especially a direct quote, but really any sort of paraphrasing, any sort of referencing of your source, explain the quote in your own words and explicitly say how it supports your point, right? It's really important to do this. Sometimes a lot of students do what I call quote dropping. They just throw a quote in there in the paragraph and then they move on without really talking about it, because to them it totally makes sense why they included this point. And maybe it is. Maybe it's incredibly obvious why that quote is used in the paragraph. Maybe the quote almost explains itself. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You still need to explain it in your own words. You still need to say why this quote is there, what the reader's supposed to get out of it, how it connects to your argument, all right? Even if you feel like it's repetitive or redundant, you still need to do it, okay? It's just you've got to get used to doing that with your quotes. Put your quotes in, refer to your sources, and then explain. Explain, 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 okay? Okay, also avoid plagiarism, all right? If you use any piece of information in your paper that is not general knowledge or didn't come out of your own head, okay? And by general knowledge, I mean something that you can really expect anyone to know, or a piece of information that you just pulled out of your own head, okay? If it is something that you got from a source, or even if it's not something you necessarily got from a source, but is so specific that that I don't trust that you would have known that on your own, you need a quote. You need to cite. Quote is the wrong word. You need to cite it with the parenthetical, right? Because without the parenthetical citation, it is plagiarism to use other people's ideas, other people's information, and not to cite it. That is called plagiarism. Okay, so with direct quotes, the parenthetical needs to be there immediately after the quote mark, right? Like as soon as you finish directly quoting, parenthetical, I will expect it to be right there, right after that quote mark. With indirect quotes, like I mentioned before, it should come just as close as possible, usually at the end of the sentence, at the most at the end of maybe a couple of sentences of summary or paraphrase, all right? But it needs to be close so that I understand this information is being cited, all right? If you have some information in a paragraph, but you don't put a parenthetical until the very end of a paragraph and it's too far away, I can definitely think, I don't know where you're getting this information from. I don't know where this is coming from. I don't know if you're plagiarizing. So just my advice is overuse the parentheticals rather than unuse them. Put them at the end of every sentence if it makes you feel better. Just be on the safe side and oversight rather than undercite. Just make sure I can tell where every piece of information is coming from. Okay, now we're going to look at some examples, all right? Hopefully this will be helpful. And again, I pulled these examples from actual student papers, the examples that you looked at last week. So hopefully, or some of these may be familiar, but I may also have edited them a little bit, okay? So this first example, you can see here, she's Incorporating a direct quote into a sentence. Jenny Cohen, a writer focusing on history, also states that over time, elegant handwriting emerges as a status symbol. And you see the quote marks there when she moves into quoting word for word from her source. You'll notice there's no end punctuation, or there's no comma or anything before time. That's because in the grammar of the way that this has been structured, it flows right in. It is just part of the sentence, okay? So that's actually okay. You'll notice at the end, after scribes, there's no period, there's just the quote mark. Then you'll see in that parenthetical, there's no author name. There's no author name because she already introduced, I think it's a she, maybe it's a he, already introduced the author, Jenny Cohen, at the beginning of the sentence. If you introduce the author in the sentence, you don't have to have the author's last name in the parenthetical. However, you do still need to have a page number, or what if you're using an article that doesn't have page numbers, something from the internet that's just one long piece of text? MLA recommends citing paragraph numbers, and that's what you see an example of here. Paragraph 4, P-A-R, period, the number, close the parenthetical, then the period, okay? Second example here. This is another good example of incorporating a direct quote just into the grammar of a sentence. One article said that, quote, developing a cursive hand, ellipses, because she skipped some words, is an important step in developing a personal style and voice. No end punctuation, quote marks, and then let's look at this parenthetical. This is an article called Why Cursive that apparently didn't have an author. All right, so if your article doesn't have an author, or if you can't find an author, you do quote marks or italicize. You just reference the title of the piece. If it's an article, it's going to be in quote marks. If it's a longer book, man, all of your longer books really should have authors, or that's weird. Anyway, you're just going to reference the title of the piece there. All right, so quote marks, Why Cursive, and this time didn't refer to the paragraph number, although they really could have in that citation to make it stronger. Close parenthetical, and then the period at the end, okay? And then that final example there is another example of incorporating a direct quote just into the grammar of the sentence. There are studies that support that kids who learn cursive rather than simply manuscript writing score better on reading and spelling tests. No end punctuation, quote marks, just the author's last name. They chose not to do the paragraph numbers here either, but apparently there's also no page numbers. If it had been from a book, or if it had been from an article with page numbers, it would have been Steinmetz 94, or whatever the page number was, close parenthetical, and period, okay? So I just want to clear this up in case some of you have confusion over it. If there are no page numbers, I strongly recommend trying to do the paragraph, indicating the paragraph number, all right? If that gets a little messy, if it's not clear paragraphs, you don't necessarily have to do it, but I would recommend doing that. So these final two citations here, where we just have the title or the author's last name and no paragraph number, technically those are correct. They're okay. I would still try to include a paragraph number if you can. Okay, here's an example of a block quote. So this is a direct word-for-word quote that is longer than 4 lines. Okay, so I just want to point things out. The sentence before, then he realized he was wasting his students' time and his own by using the archaic methods of teaching grammar. There's a period there. There also could have been a colon. That would have been technically correct. A comma would not have been correct. But period, and then we jump into the block quote, and you'll notice that the entire block quote is indented from the normal text. There are no quote marks in the use of this block quote. You'll also notice at the very end, the period comes right after the end of the sentence. Then you get the parenthetical, small, 176, right? That's the author's last name and the page number, no period after that. That's how block quotes work. And then when you jump down to the next line and start right on writing about the quote, finishing off the rest of your paragraph, that comes back out flush with the margin by using the same methodology to teach, okay? So that's how you do a direct block quote. Okay, here's an example of a paraphrasing quote, right? Many of these creators were making up grammar rules that were entirely dependent on their own preferences. So nothing in this section or in this sentence has been quoted word for word, but they still were getting this information from a source. So they still cited the source, McBride 87, parenthetical, and then the period, okay? Period will still go on the outside, even of parentheticals in paraphrasing, okay? Okay, let's talk about incorporating your primary research though, because this, I guarantee, is going to be mostly new for you guys. You've had to do primary research. You've had to do your own surveys, your own interviews, your own analysis, your own whatever it was that you're incorporating into your paper, right? How do you do that, and how do you make that sound good? All right, so here's where we're going to talk about personal pronouns again. You can use personal pronouns if you have to, absolutely have to, right? If it's going to sound super weird to talk about your research without using personal pronouns, then go ahead. You can. It is your primary research and you can own it. However, I do want to challenge yourself to try to use the impersonal third-person pronouns if possible. Look at the ways that your sources discuss their primary research and see how they're doing it, if they're using a lot of personal pronouns, or if they're still if they're talking about the study showed, the research showed, instead of my study showed, my research showed, right? Try to keep it personal, third-person pronouns if you possibly can without making it sound super weird. So to talk about quoting yourself, yes, your primary research will need a citation in your works cited page, okay? And MLA has all sorts of rules for all sorts of primary research things, surveys, interviews, all sorts of that sort of stuff. So you will need to have some sort of citation for yourself for whatever your primary research is in your works cited. And then when you talk about your research, you may even need parenthetical citations, right? If you're using quotes from a survey, right? If you are using quotes from an interview, if you're using any sort of information that you need to reference the fact that it's your primary research, you have a parenthetical. And you are going to be the author name most of the time, unless it's an interview and then the author name might be the person you're interviewing. Actually look that up. That might not be right. My final piece of advice on incorporating your primary research is to try to keep the tone of your paper as formal as possible. Try to keep the flow with the rest of your paper. Like, I don't know if you noticed this in some of the student examples you read, but sometimes it's pretty jarring. You're reading a formal research paper, and then all of a sudden we're talking about, hey, once upon a time in my life, I did this, and here's my personal experience, and it feels jarring. It feels like, oh, we're in a completely different paper here all of a sudden. Try not to do that, all right? The best papers with the highest grades are going to be the ones that can incorporate their primary research, making it sound as formal and technical and flowing with the rest of the paper as possible. Okay, and finally, don't forget all of the MLA rules, things we've talked about in all of our previous units. Don't forget about your works cited page and all the formatting things. So I just got a few reminders here. Proper formatting, double space, the 12-point font. I recommend Times New Roman, please. The no extra spaces between paragraphs. Don't forget to have your heading, guys. Don't forget your name, my name, class name, date in the right format, which is number, month, year, right? Don't forget about page numbers. With your last name in the upper right corner, the 1-inch margins, all of those things about formatting, still important, still really crucial. And then spend some time with your works cited page. Make sure all of your sources are cited correctly, okay? If you use one of those citation generators online, double check everything, all right? Make sure that you have everything alphabetized. Make sure you've got the hanging indent, everything's still double spaced. Make sure you figure out how to cite your own work, right? Your primary research. And look everything up. If you have your handbook, look everything up in your handbook. But there's also the online resources in Blackboard, the Purdue Writing Lab pages that I've linked you to, or you can just Google anything. Google finds everything to look up all of these MLA rules. They're important. Make sure you are paying attention to all of those details. Okay, guys, that's it. You've made it. That was the final lecture for at least this unit. I hope these weren't so incredibly boring. I hope they're useful for you and help you as you get your paper written this week, because you do need to have a draft in progress to me by early next week. So follow all of these directions. These are the things that I'm going to be bringing up and talking about when I read through your drafts in progress, okay? Let me know if you have any questions about anything, and take care.